Namaste and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anshul Gautam, researcher at Indic Researcher Forum. I welcome you all to the session 1 India Japan Cooperation and Indo Pacific Strategy. For this session, we have Dr. Jagannath Panda, Professor Satoshi Kuichi, and Professor Dattesh Parulekar. The session is chaired by Group Captain R. Srinivasan, Vishesh Seva Medal, PhD. Group Captain R. Srinivasan served in Indian Air Force for 32 years and retired in 2018. He holds an MSW, LLB, and PG diploma in International Humanitarian Law and PhD from Pondicherry University in Political Sociology. He is also a SATS alumni of ICRC. He is an internationally published author for 13 book chapters and a number of conference papers on governance, regionalism, political economy, women and armed conflicts, etc. He has authored 2 books, Peking at Packing and Research Writing, a Complete Guide. Apart from these, he has published 4 books as edited volumes on India-Mongolia relations, Africa, Asian geopolitics, and borders. He has co-edited the Handbook on South Asia. He is also a senior fellow in Defense Research and Studies, which is a think tank on strategic affairs. He was conferred Vishesh Seva Medal for his distinguished services of a high order to the country by Honorable President of India in 2012. He is currently an independent researcher. He is currently an independent researcher and publisher cum editor-in-chief of Electronic Journal of Social and Strategic Studies. He is also the founder director of Pragna Center for Research, a non-profit company engaged in promoting research and publication in social science and strategic studies. I request the audience to kindly mute their mic and ask their questions in the chat box. Now I request Srinivasan sir to take the proceedings of the session forward.
Thank you, Anchal, Satoshi-san, Professor Panda, Professor Dattesh. It's a pleasure and it's my privilege to be in this session and to have the honor of meeting all of you. And we have heard some exceptionally brilliant thoughts from from eminent people in the inaugural session, and I feel that they have already set the tone for for our session actually, which is based on Bharat-Japan geopolitical strategic interests and concerns. Just to give a brief concept, it's as chair of this session. We are aware that Bharat and Japan share a very long and I must say uninterrupted relation spanning over at least 1500 years. Historical records are showing that the Buddhist monks from India landed in Japan sometime in the 6th century AD. But the popular belief that the relationship between these two countries are resting on the Buddhist connection alone is not entirely true. Professor Noboru Karashima of the University of Tokyo had worked on South Indian connections with Japan from 1958. In fact, he stayed in Mysore in India, worked with one of the most eminent historians of this country, K. Nilakanta Shastri, and he adopted K. Nilakanta Shastri's techniques of using archaeological evidence to support history, bringing out the connection between southern India and Japan. Japan and Bharat today are examples of nations that stand together not merely as a convenient alliance against inimical forces, but are also committed to promoting democracy and peace among the international community. For those of us who are familiar with the Japanese history, we will find that the Charter Oath of April 1868 of the Meiji Emperor's time, a foundational document for democratic principles towards nation building. It may also be noted that the Meiji Emperor closely followed the developments in colonial India at that time, and as K.M. Panikkar observes in his famous Asia and Western Dominance book, proclaimed the Charter Oath to prevent the ills of colonization. If we just look at only, out of the 5 charter oaths, if we look at only 2 of them, we will know why I refer to as foundational democratic principles towards nation building. The first oath says, and I read, deliberative assemblies shall be established on an extensive scale, and all governmental matters shall be determined by public discussion. I don't think any other definition of democracy is required. And five, charter number 5, knowledge shall be sought throughout the world in order to promote the welfare of the empire. Of course, you are referring to Japanese empire at that time, but remember, knowledge from all over the world. And we are aware that Japan actually truly practices this even today. Even today. Contemporary challenges in the world, especially concerning Asia and South Asia in particular, are obviously considered as the driving force behind the greater cooperation between Bharat and Japan. But in my opinion, it is not sufficient to read the Chinese challenge or contemporary geopolitical compulsions as the prime cause for such cooperation. I am also of the view that while being a substantial mutual partner, the relations with USA should not be seen as the cementing factor for the ever-growing Bharat-Japan cooperation. This relationship between these two countries stands on its own deep-rooted and mutual respect. Former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, pledged to realize public and private investments worth Japanese yen 3.5 trillion and doubling the number of Japanese companies in India. We all know that Prime Minister Abe was a committed soul, and we have many reasons to remember him fondly forever. With the achievement of the investment target, Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Kishida, during their first bilateral visit to India, expressed their shared intention to realize and take the investment forward to 5 trillion Japanese yen for public and private investment and financing from India to Japan in the next 5 years. Japan is the 5th largest investor in Indian economy with a cumulative FTA inflow in excess of US $38 billion. From April 2000 to March 2023. Currently, there are over 1439 to be precise, Japanese companies that have direct and indirect investments in Indian ventures. We are also aware, all of us in India, that Suzuki and Mitsubishi are household names here. During Prime Minister Singh's visit to Japan in October 2008, the two leaders issued the joint declaration on security cooperation between Japan and India. There are also various frameworks of security and defense dialogue between Japan and India, including Foreign and Defense Ministerial Meeting 2+2 meetings, and the Defense Ministerial Dialogue and Coast Guard to Coast Guard Dialogue. In September 2022, the second 2+2 meeting was held in Tokyo. On September 9th, 2020, the agreement between the government of Japan and the government of the Republic of India concerning reciprocal provision of supplies and services between the self-defense forces of Japan and Indian armed forces, called the ACSA, was signed. ACSA came into force on July 11th, 2021. India has been the largest recipient of Japanese ODA loan for the past few decades. Delhi Metro is one of the shining examples and the successful examples of Japanese cooperation through the utilization of ODA. Japan continues to cooperate in supporting strategic connectivity linking South Asia to Southeast Asia through the synergy between Act East policy and the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. There are 12 bilateral treaties between our nations, commencing from 1949, covering promotion of peace, science and technology, economic cooperation, peaceful use of nuclear energy, culture, and military cooperation. The purpose of laying out this context is to show that when we say our geostrategic interests need to be addressed, we should not be limiting ourselves only to military cooperation in the context of the geopolitical atmosphere that is prevailing today. We have had extensive and age-old standing relationship. And this relationship has to be taken forward in multifarious dimensions if Bharat and Nippon have to work together towards their common objective, promoting peace and international harmony. So saying, it is my privilege now to introduce the first speaker. We have three speakers for this session, and it is my privilege now to introduce the first speaker, that is Professor Jagannath Panda, and then invite him to deliver his talk. Professor Panda is the head of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. He is also the editor for ISDP. In addition to his primary appointment at ISDP, Dr. Panda is the director for Europe-Asia Research Cooperation at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies and a senior fellow at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, the Netherlands. Dr. Panda also holds a number of adjunct affiliations in various think tanks and institutions in Asia and Indo-Pacific. He holds a position of International Research Fellow at the Cannon Institute for Global Studies, Japan, a Senior Research Fellow at the United Services Institution of India, a Senior Fellow at the East Asian Security Center at Bond University, Australia, a Senior Research Fellow at the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies, Tokyo. He was a fellow at India's premier think tank, IDSA, for more than a decade and a half. He will be talking to us on an India-Japan vision for free and open Indo-Pacific. Professor Panda, the pleasure is ours to listen to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Group Captain Srinivasan, sir. A long time to see you. I believe I met you in Delhi long time back, sometime I don't recollect, but thank you very much for your kind introduction. And great pleasure to be here in the same panel with two of my good friends whom I acknowledge about for their scholarships and their mentorship for various strategic issues. That is Satoshi-san and also Datesh-san from India. And thank you very much to the Indic Research Forum for this kind invitations. And I think we need to talk about India-Japan more and more at a time when this relationship has been the flag bearer for many of the strategic and security issues in Indo-Pacific. Now, as you rightly mentioned, Group Captain Srinivasan, a lot of this credits goes to the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, how he saw India as a credible partner, a good friend in Indo-Pacific, and the merit to position India and Japan relations as a future relationship. And he invested there. And today, that's why we have a methodological arrangement to talk about the progressive nature of India-Japan partnerships. It's not that, government change in Delhi, government change in Tokyo, a new leadership comes in Tokyo and in Delhi, and we start afresh. No, I think there is the good thing about India-Japan relationship today is that there is already a lot of frameworks have been there, and we just need to execute the relationship to a credible partnerships through these frameworks. Now, let me, as a scholar who has been writing on the subject, who has written extensively on the subject, who has monitored this relationship from a close track 2 and 1.5 dialogue being from Delhi, I think let me start with 3-4 main points. That I think what we need to ask today is that where does the India-Japan ties stand today after Prime Minister Abe Shinzo? I think 2022, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of diplomatic ties. And while it is an occasion to feel good, it is an occasion to draw optimism, but we should also be equally cautious about our future. The future lies with a lot of complex elements, complex variables, and I think that would really test and pose challenges for India-Japan ties. Now, what are those challenges? Those challenges are geographic in nature, those challenges are territorial in nature, and those challenges are spatial in nature. And therefore, what we need to talk about the future of India-Japan relation is that how to really navigate this relationship or this partnership as the testing partnership for 21st century in Indo-Pacific. And I think that is the taste, to talk about the challenges that will arise from different geographical locations, from South China Sea to from East China Sea to the Indian Ocean regions, to the territorial complexities from Taiwan crisis to India-China boundary dispute, to the Chinese incursion in the region of Senkaku Island. How India-Japan partnerships should see all of these challenges coming, and how these partnerships should challenge particularly the authoritarian, adventurism that we are seeing in the regions. And I think that would be the taste of this partnership, which will test the character of these partnerships. Now, I have three propositions to make. One is that the challenges can only be made when there is an open thought to address those challenges. And I think in both the foreign policies, Japanese foreign policy as well as in Indian foreign policy, we see that flexible. We see that flexibility in terms of seeing the new challenges in a new format. And today, Japan is changing. Japan is changing for a good number of regions. Today, we are seeing that there is a defense reforms is happening. Japan has introduced the national, revising the national security strategy to national defense strategy to innovation strategy. So those, reforms within Japan talks about Japan's, preparation for the future, particularly keeping the challenges that it is going to face. Similarly, what we are seeing in India, a range of reforms happening. Some of them we might agree, some of them we might not agree. But the good thing is about India is that there is a kind of rejuvenation we are seeing almost in every sector. And there is a lot of changes are happening to the legal measures, to the administrative structure, to the normal bureaucratic mechanisms. And that's a good development as far as the Indian foreign policy is concerned. So I think that brings India and Japan together in terms of looking at the regions and the future challenges in a new context. The second aspect that needs to be really talked about is that how India and Japan relationship today are not really based on a national-centric composition. It is a much more state-centric composition. And this is where I have been arguing and I have been writing that if you see in the context of India-China relationship, last 2 decades, between India and China, there was a lot of state-to-state cooperation framework we talked about. Sister city concept to, sister city and sister mega city concepts. We talked about, establishing smart city collaboration between India and China. But that didn't work out. That didn't work out because of the Chinese behavior, because of the Chinese aggressive nature towards the Indian market as well as towards India when it comes to the boundary dispute. But one good thing we are doing in the context of that state-to-state or city-to-city collaboration today is that we are seeing that the India-Japan relationship is positioned much more domestically today. And therefore, the credit goes to Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, where the current Prime Minister Kishida is rightfully pushing forward, and the current Prime Minister PM Modi. What we are seeing that today that there is a unique state-to-state cooperation is happening between 7 Indian states to almost 6 or 7 Japanese cities. And some of them are, prefectures, some of them are cities in Japan. And today there are more than 6 MOUs have been signed. These issues are talking about that this relationship is not really national-centric or just one dimension. It is much more deeper than that. The third aspect, which is really interesting about India-Japan relationship, and that actually talks about the future of India-Japan relationship, is that we are talking about people-centric issues in India-Japan partnerships. We are talking about science and technology collaborations to health, and some of these issues today are actually critical variables in the Indo-Pacific regions. Today, when we are talking about Quad, collaborating within the Quad, we have been, talking about working groups or subgroups within the Quad format, talking about science and technology collaborations, addressing pandemic and health issues, cyber issues, and all of these issues are being talked in length between India and Japan, and that's a really a positive thing. Now, while talking about all of this good thing, my second question is that I think that is also another critical aspect of my presentation today, is that what is really missing in India-Japan ties today? Why this relationship is not really becoming one of those most trusted partnership that is supposed to be. Of course, there is a lot of chemistry between US and Japan. There is a lot of chemistry happening between India and US when it comes to security and defense partnership. But the same kind of thing we are not really witnessing in India-Japan ties, particularly in the areas of security and defense ties. And I think that is the key point here. Even though there has been a good beginning in terms of talking about the security issues, critical security issues, but then what this partnership is currently actually lacking at this moment is the global character to this partnership. And I think that is one of the most important aspects we need to really talk about India-Japan partnerships. And the global character is that this relationship is very much bilateral centric. At the same time, it is becoming more Indo-Pacific centric. But again, at the Indo-Pacific level, we are unable to really establish a credible partnerships which will actually give us a global character. And that is something where we need to really work on in the next few years. Now, what are those areas? One area where we could work between India and Japan is the third country partnerships, be it in the Southeast Asia with Thailand, with Bangladesh, or with some other Southeast Asian countries, or be it in the Indian Ocean regions, factoring South Sri Lanka or Maldives. I think we need to have trilateral partnerships. In fact, I must share with you because I have been, part of a study group for many years, and Professor Parulekar is also with us in this study group, and we have been talking about it. In fact, if you see in the context of India-Japan partnerships, there was a talk about collaborating, in terms of investment and in terms of planning in the Chabahar port in Iran a few years back. But the Americans sanctioned Iran, and then we stopped it. So I think we need to really think innovative ways to collaborate between India and Japan in the sub-sectoral level, be it in the Middle East or in the Indian Ocean or in the Southeast Asia, including in South Asian regions. We need to talk about India-Japan partnerships in the context of Indo-Pacific. Of course, Japan is one of the credible country to invest in India's northeastern regions. All the 7-8 states in Japan is investing, which is really impressive. But again, we need to bring much more regional character, which will give much more credibility to India-Japan partnerships. We are having Malabar exercises, we are having Japan-India maritime exercises, but then I think we need to have much more regional character bringing to India-Japan partnerships, which will actually shape the future of these partnerships. There are many other areas like, undersea cables, submarine cables systems, and broadband issues. And then we could also talk about green economies. These are fisheries, port development, coastal development. These are actually new areas where India and Japan could actually work together with a range of countries in the Indo-Pacific regions. My last point is that I think what is really is going to be very difficult in terms of building these partnerships, and which is why we are facing this difficulty. I think at this moment, what we are witnessing in India-Japan partnership is that I think both the countries are not having enough chemistry in the multilateral forums, be it in terms of creating that necessary international pressure in terms of reforming the United Nations Security Council permanent membership, or in terms of creating a good chemistry from G7 to G20 to many other international forums. I think a lot of things are missing, and there we need a credible partnerships in terms of not only creating a necessary understanding, but also creating that necessary pressure as two credible partners, trusted partners in the Indo-Pacific regions. And now, one thing what we need to really understand is that I think most of my argument is coming from this point that when India actually withdrew from RCEP membership and did not really went to sign the RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, there would have there were supposed to be a lot of credible understanding between India and Japan and India and South Korea. That did not happen. And that explains to the fact that in the multilateral forums, in the trading mechanisms, multilateral trading mechanisms, we need a much more robust understanding, which will actually take forward India-Japan partnerships in times to come. And there are many other areas where we could particularly work, particularly infrastructure building, because Japan is known for its credibility as an international actor in building and going for resilient and quality infrastructure. We could talk about Japan is promoting the EPQI strategy for a long time, expanded partnership of quality infrastructure initiatives, and I think India needs to really encash on that. We could also talk about how India could become a partner in the Blue Dot Network partnership that Japan is having with Australia and US. Then we could talk about other security-oriented understanding in the Indo-Pacific regions, including perhaps AUKUS kind of agreement or Five Eyes kind of expanded formulations. But that's that's for a real-time future, maybe 10 to 15 years. But we need to be really practical, and I think here the practicality remains that we need to have credible trilateral and minilateral partnerships in the Indo-Pacific. One last point is that I think this is where India-Japan partnership should also look at it, is a good and stronger defense partnership. If we see India is having today a stronger defense partnership with a range of countries, like not only with the US, but also with Israel, with France, and which is the idea is to withdraw from purchasing a lot of equipments or military equipments from Russia. So in terms of becoming more independent and go for the joint production scales of the defense equipments, we are diversifying our defense procurement process. And I think Japan and India must encash on this opportunity, even though we have signed AXA agreement between India and Japan, but I think a lot has to be done in terms of defense sector, particularly not only in terms of exercises which is happening already between India and Japan, but also in terms of how the defense trade can be the most important component of India-Japan trade and defense trade and economic ties. And I think with these observations, I'll stay here, and then I'll invite your comments and questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Panda. In fact, you have made very important points. I will just summarize them as just 4 main points. You started with the question, how should the partnership see this? Both the countries, how should they see the partnership? And very rightly, you pointed to the reforms that are taking place in both the countries, and I felt that you sincerely expressed your hope that these reforms will keep the objective of strengthening this partnership and taking it forward as a main agenda. I sincerely feel so. The second thing that you definitely talked about, which is quite interesting, is what is missing in this partnership. There are many factors which you did point out, and very rightly, which I fully endorse, and I feel it requires serious consideration, is bringing in we already have a bilateral character, but bringing in a global character to the relationships. That means taking both of us together for third country partnerships, which is very much required, especially in this region, South Asia and Southeast Asia. That will not only cement our ties further, but it will also give fillip to much needed change in governance and various other dimensions in this entire region of Asia. The third point which you definitely put up was what is difficult? What are the difficulties that we are facing? And the point that there is a need to enhance the chemistry between these two nations in multilateral forums. You gave the example of RCEP fallout and all, but it's a point on which I think both at political level and at various multilateral levels, we need to work very strongly on this, because that chemistry is very important. Fortunately, both the countries see eye to eye. We are true democracies and we believe in peace and harmony for all, not just the two of us. Okay, that's our strength. But as you said, yes, we have to enhance that chemistry. And you ended with pointing to the need for a stronger defense cooperation apart from the joint exercises that we have. And that is a sector which is growing in India. We have considerable Japanese presence in our industrial landscape, but this particular dimension of defense production and therefore joint defense production is something which we must seriously explore, because that is a need of the hour, not only for us. It's not just for India, it's for Japan also. Because the Chinese threat to Japan is anything that all of us know. It's palpable. We can reach out and touch it in the air. Okay, therefore, it is very much the need of the time. Thank you for bringing out such wonderful, thought-provoking points. Thank you so much again. We will take the questions at the end of all the three talks. I have the privilege now to invite and introduce Professor Satoshi Ikuichi-san. Okay, Satoshi-san is a professor of religion and global security at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology of the University of Tokyo. He is the founding chair of the RCAST Open Laboratory for Emergence Strategies, that is ROLES. He is a scholar on Islamic political thought and Middle East politics. He was a visiting scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in 2009, visiting fellow at Clare Hall, University of Cambridge in 2010, and a senior visiting scholar and scholar in residence at Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies at Tel Aviv University from 2022 to 23. He will be talking to us on Japan's national security strategy and concerns over Taiwan, scope for India-Japan security cooperation in the Taiwan crisis. Satoshi-san, we are all ears. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oh, can you hear me? It's okay? Okay. Oh, thank you again, Dr. Srinivasan, for your very succinct but very good opening presentation and also introduction. Your speech have rightly contextualized our discussion in this session and also the entire dialogue today. My name is, as I was introduced, Satoshi Ikeuchi, a professor of religion and global security at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology, which is called RCAST, of the University of Tokyo. RCAST is an interdisciplinary department in the University of Tokyo. And in this interdisciplinary institute, I have established 3 years ago, I have established an think tank called ROLES, an RCAST Open Laboratory for Emergence Strategies, which is conducting independently, autonomously, but with cooperation with Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or Prime Minister's office, or other Japanese companies, security and strategic studies in a global scope. And I'm not an unusual speaker in the Japan or Bharat Nippon dialogue. My area of specialization, as Jaganas knows, is the Middle East, not South Asia. But of course, first, Dr. Taniguchi-san's name convinced me to accept this invitation. But it's a challenge for me to represent Japan and talk about Taiwan contingency and Japan's position in its defense security policy. But I accepted it for many reasons. And first of all, Dr. Taniguchi and also Jagannath, Dr. Jagannath founder, he, uh, I'm always with you, if possible, on the same podium. And your ISDP and RCAST, my place, has concluded the MOU in 2021 and an academic exchange. In that MOU, joint research activities on the Indo-Pacific are stipulated, particularly between my think tank, Rhodes, and your place, ISDP, the Stockholm Center for South Asia and the Indo-Pacific. So even though I'm not an India specialist or Taiwan contingency specialist, I've been first of all I've been inevitably interested in India in these days through the Middle Eastern eyes. As everyone knows, Abraham Accords are expanding to ITU2, and then that IMEC is connected to Europe. So why not reciprocate from us, from Japan, to connect it to further to the East Asia? That's the entire, the question for us, and it worth talking about it on this format or later. So in the new regional dynamism in the Gulf and the Middle East inevitably brought India into the Middle Eastern map. So Japan, India, or Nippon Bharat relations also will be or have to be a more regional based or trans-regional based, overlapping South Asia and the Middle East, connecting East Asia with it. So yes, I'm kind of representing the future Japan's position, more global minded and more multilateral or conjunction of minilateral based policy. But now, yes, the title of the talk of mine today is about Taiwan. Yes, actually, in the Middle East nowadays, people in the Gulf or in the Levant, people ask me about this Taiwan issue. In the past years, 10 years ago, it was impossible. And no one talked about Taiwan or East Asia, but now the world is more Asia centered, and even Middle Eastern people are looking at Asia, not the Europe and not the transatlantic. They are finally looking at Asia and Indo-Pacific, and then find Japan, also India in their perspective. So yes, in my explanation to the foreigners, in the Middle East, of course, India is more close to our region, East Asia. So you may not need, for a very basic introduction about this issue in Taiwan issue and what possible Taiwan contingency, but still, I have some formula to respond to the heightened interest, heightened concern about East Asian crisis. The Middle Eastern people are, concerned about East Asian crisis. That shows how global, world politics, world affairs changed. In the past two decades or three, we have been always talking about the Middle East as the center of world crises. But now, even people in the Middle East is talking about crisis, and they some of them offer mediation between Japan and China. So it's not realistic at all. But how to explain to them is nowadays important, and how to prepare for the future possible crisis in East Asia, and how to properly involve world leaders and world opinions in it. So first of all, my take on Taiwan contingency is first of all, point one, not imminent. Yes, not tomorrow. It's not the issue of tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, next week. No, even though there are much speculative reports and but uh, uh, Chinese invasion of Taiwan is not taken as imminent in East Asia. People are still calm in Tokyo, yeah, as Dr. Jagannath have visited and witnessed recently. And even in Taipei, it's the same. People are very calm, where uh, a lot more people are a lot more used to those speculations and tensions. Um, Also, last month I visited Korea, Seoul. Even the U.S. UN base over there, people are still, living as usual. No heightened tension felt. But second point, the threat exists. If China, if China, thinks it can invade Taiwan. So that's the basic condition we are faced with. If Chinese leaders or the leader thinks it can take Taiwan easily by force, it it might it may decide. Um, so, but most of the analysis by the experts in Japan are probable decision points for Chinese leaders for this of for this decision. The moment of truth is comes not tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but between 5 years and 10, when their military build up catches up U.S. military, and in 10 years or more, China will be more confident about their nuclear arsenal, matching those of U.S. Um, so the threat exists, but the time span is a little bit more longer. But 5 years, life is short. 5 years, just a minutes. So we have to prepare from now. So we are now very serious, not in panic, but we are serious in preparing for the days to come. And the third point, in Japan, finally, we have realized in the public opinion and also among policymakers, there's been serious recognition that Taiwan contingency is Japan contingency. So it's not it's about Taiwan, but it's about Japan. In the past, there has been debate about if there is a Taiwan contingency, um, what Japan can do, where Japan is situated. That was a past debate, past discussion. Right now, we have realized that China might attack first Japan or US bases in Japanese soil. That's a very rational strategy if they decide to take Taiwan by force to prevent U.S. military intervention. Inevitably, they will you know uh, neutralize. They must neutralize to be successful U.S. bases, U.S. forces in Japan before or at the same time or before they invade Taiwan. So there was a Japanese word makikomare. It's get involved. Fear of getting involved in Taiwan contingency, or getting involved in neighbors' trouble. That was the existing or conventional talk about Taiwan contingency in Japan, but it's changing right now because there's a more serious recognition of the inevitability of Japan involved from the start without choosing sides. Japanese targets in Japan will be chosen by China, not chosen by us. So that's a new recognition among Japanese public opinion and policy makers. So for China, if it decides to take Taiwan by force, Japan will be the natural target. So Japan can't be neutral nor choosing sides in the Taiwan contingency. So the fourth point is the big if or big when. If China decides to invade, when it will. Yes. As I've said, you know, it's a it, it's a moment of truth for Chinese leaders. So it, ultimately, we don't know. We don't know. But if we think that the Chinese leaders' ultimate purpose, what is the ultimate purpose is, um, we suppose the ultimate purpose is a maintenance of their rule, communist rule on China. So in this case, they cannot lose any external expeditions. If they declare war or undeclared but made a large scale aggression and then expelled, repelled, then the legitimacy will be damaged seriously, and no Chinese leader can decide on such a decision if there's a high probability of repelled. So the if and when is the point, and when Chinese leaders are perceivable or convinced of their success. Uh, um, so the fifth point is how to prevent it. How do we prevent Chinese leaders to think that? That's the moment of truth, and that's that's the point where very certain victory it will be given if they decide it and go. So, how do we prevent Taiwan contingency to happen? That's a topic right now among Japanese policy makers and policy thinkers, and public opinion is following little by little, digesting this reality, digesting new topics. How do we prevent for Chinese leaders to decide this final decision? So, um, that's the way Japanese society as a whole, Japanese nation as a whole, is moving, moving toward more realistic policy in the security. So, experts talks about last year's new document, revised document of strategy, and but actually those new documents are the symptom, or the just the result of this fundamental change, very silent but huge change of positions and directions in Japan's security policy and in general public's attitudes towards the world. So, um, okay, so the point is the general recognition emerging on consensus among Japanese is the point is how do we convince or keep convincing Chinese leaders it is impossible. it is impossible to invade Taiwan and successfully accomplish it. So the topic is deterrence, not fighting war with China, but deter China to make this fatal decision. Fatal decision we see like Russia, sometimes in the Middle East, leaders can take very fatal decisions by mistakes. But that Chinese leaders' mistakes are too costly for all of us. So we must prevent this kind of mistakes to happen. So the last point, sixth point, is alliances and alignment or partnerships. Japan, as you know, has been long, uh, uh, dependent dependent on one uh, alliance with the U.S. Japanese alliance it has been and is the cornerstone, huge cornerstone of Japan's security. But at the same time, right now, Japan it's not diversifying, but it's expanding this basic asset of Japan-U.S. relations. Now, so FOIP is a vision of this. It's not only security, but it's a total vision for the desirable world in which Japan and US is the inevitable part of it. And also, Quad, this is the expansion for Japan, is natural expansion of US-Japan relationship based on security, but also trade and investment and common values and common lifestyles. And so, from my point of view, we can do it more. Indo-Pacific is larger than Quad area, and Middle East, Suez Canal, East, even Red Sea and East Mediterranean to Europe. We can expand. And that's my own vision, but the Japanese public is not so far, yeah, such a visionary. But I think it's realistic. India is in the center, and now India is connecting Europe to the Middle East and South Asia, and so Japan-India relations is very, very, prominent. Promising in the future. If we look at it in a global context, we have very good neighbors. If we can choose neighbors, we have very good neighbors in this based on this relationship with India. So that's my overview of the Taiwan contingency issue and what's behind it, what's the change behind it in the side of Japan. Um, Thank you very much.
Yeah, Satoshi-san, thank you so much. In fact, you made some very, very important points. I think we should carry. I will just try and capture them, in short terms. The first point which you made, that the world is now Asia-centric, is something which I think we are all talking about it. Everybody talks about it. But the real meaning of it, that we have to stand together for working together towards common objectives. Asia-centric, Asia being Asia-centric, and Asia being world-centric. That kind of a depth of thinking has to come in almost every country and every political leadership. It's a very important point, I feel. And you started by saying that you are going to look at the Taiwan crisis after proclaiming that you are not a Taiwan expert, that you usually stick to only the Middle East, and therefore you chose to speak with a Middle Eastern eye on this issue. All these preconditions you made, but whatever you have said further are showing the other way around, that you are very deeply following, studying, analyzing, and appreciating the South China Sea issues and the Taiwan issue also. The second point that you made is very right. We also agree with you that the Taiwan crisis, yes, it is not imminent. It will happen. But when will it happen? That is the third point you touched upon. You said it will happen. It may not happen tomorrow, but then there is a need to prepare. Okay, to that extent, all of us are with you on board. But then you caught us, I think, a little by surprise by saying that Taiwan's contingency is Japan's contingency. Okay, that's a very interesting perspective. I think we need to look at it with a fresh eye because you have provoked us into that direction by pointing out that in order to effectively and militarily take over Taiwan, China has to first neutralize the American military on Japanese soil with two carrier groups, American carrier groups operating from ex-Japan. I think that point is something which we have been missing in normal discourse, I suppose. So it's a very, very pertinent point that you have made. And then one more question you raised. So if it has to happen, when? There are no definitive answers, as you very rightly said. But it is more interesting to see that you are referring to the cost of that adventure by China. If it wins, it gets Taiwan. It neutralizes US. It neutralizes everybody else's, pulverizes everybody else's, and takes over Taiwan. If it wins, China wins. Option number one. But what if it loses? The entire communist regime, the entire edifice that they have built as China, as PRC from 1949, will just crash. It will just disappear from the face of the earth, just like Nazi Germany. Okay. Adolf Hitler is a footnote in history. Okay. PRC will become a footnote in history if it loses. And therefore, your last point that Japan, not only Japan, you said Japan should, but I feel that all of us should, all like-minded nations should work together to make that cost so unaffordable that China will perennially delay a military adventure on Taiwan. That is the only option. As I see it, I mean, I fully endorse with the thought. Okay, you talked about IMEC, you talked about other initiatives, using all this for enhancing the deterrence. But the real deterrence is cost. The cost of losing PRC by CCP. Should that happen, then the whole, reason or whatever we call it, reason for the existence, very existence of China as we see it today, will no more be. It will cease to be. Okay, so I think you have brought in some fresh and energizing points into our way of looking at things insofar as Taiwan and the South China Sea crisis is concerned, as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned. Thank you very much for those very insightful thoughts, and in the very informal manner in which you managed to convey it, but you are on the dot board, let me assure you. The dots registered. Okay. So saying, Satoshi-san, thank you very much again. And it's now my privilege to, I don't have to get introduced to Professor Datesh because he knows me, but then for the sake of protocol and propriety for the audience, I must do so. So therefore, first I will introduce Professor Datesh Parulekar, and then I will invite him to talk to us. Professor Datesh Parulekar is an assistant professor of international relations and strategic studies at the School of International and Area Studies, Goa University. His areas of specialization include Indian foreign policy, Chinese political economy, strategic maritime affairs with reference to Indo-Pacific, West Asian and African security systems. I'm personally aware that he is an expert on Africa. Okay. So he is visiting faculty at the Rashtriya Raksha University, Gujarat, and affiliated with the Indian Institute of Management, Indore, and Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur. He is a fellow of the Middle East Institute, New Delhi, visiting faculty at the Naval War College, Goa, and has lectured frequently at most national defense institutions, that is the College of Defense Management, the College of Air Warfare, the National Defense College, New Delhi, the Defense Services Staff College, Wellington, and the Army War College, Mo, and of course the Maritime Warfare Center, Vishakhapatnam. He is currently part of the academic and policy pertinent strategic projects with the Kajima Institute for Peace, Japan, the Institute for Security and Development Policy, ISDP, Sweden, and the Korea Foundation. He is a periodic but a prolific strategic commentator and analyst on platforms of nationalist-minded institutions such as the India Foundation, the Forum for Integrated National Security, and the Indic Research Forum, many more. So saying, I welcome Professor Parleka, who will be talking to us on India-Japan relations amidst Russia-Ukraine conflict. Professor Parleka, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, thank you, Group Captain Srinivasan. Great pleasure to be back with you in the chair, of course. And I see my good friend, Dr. Jagannath Panda, whose robust research I've been a great admirer, and I think it's a sense of great inspiration for all of us. Also great to be introduced to Satoshi-san, and look forward to remaining engaged with you going forward. So I'm going to speak to you on a topic that I believe in the normal context would be a left field topic, which is an out of place topic, because when we discuss India-Japan relations, invariably it is discussed in the context of the Indo-Pacific and maybe in a global sense as we discussed it. But very rarely would we want to put the microscope of the India-Japan equations or engagement in the context of something which is so geographically far away from both countries, which is the Russia-Ukraine crisis. But it also gives us a very interesting lens of analysis to be able to transpose Ukraine-Russia, its geographical situation, into, let's say, the Indo-Pacific, and to look at what are the connectivities and disconnectivities in this particular aspect. So let me begin with a first hypothesis on the India-Japan relationship. And I've been somebody who's trying to, kind of advocate and research on this aspect of an India-Japan plus framework. Because I do believe, honestly, that for all the strong complementarity that Tokyo and New Delhi show up in terms of normativity and in terms of rhetorical flourish, and of course the bilateral quotient of engagement is very strong, when it comes to performance at a regional level, when it comes to delivering with a certain degree of synergization and harmony in the Indo-Pacific, that is where the relationship is quite underwhelming. So, for example, when we look at the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, announced with much fanfare, but 6-7 years down the line, we are trying to see how we can revive this and in what format can it be revived. We talk of ASEAN centrality. Both Japan speaks of ASEAN centrality, we speak of ASEAN centrality, but there is not much to show in terms of an India-Japan coordinated project performance in this ASEAN region. Japan has its own strong presence in ASEAN. India has its presence in ASEAN. Both have a convergent approach to ASEAN centrality. But then if that be so, then why can't it be translated into a serious, kind of a project performance, which would then send messages out to our common adversary, which is China? So the hypothesis is strong degree of bilateral quotient, but there's a problem in terms of coordinating this strategy and taking it from convergence to synergization and harmony. Now, when we transpose this into the Ukraine context, I bring forth what Dr. Jaishankar mentioned when he was in Europe and when he basically, showed Europe the mirror. In fact, he said that it would be very wrong to link two different situations which are happening in two different parts of the world. There is no reason to believe, and I accept what Group Captain Srinivasan said, that there is no reason to believe that what is happening in Ukraine will either accelerate or decelerate China's view on Taiwan. Of course, if you see very closely, China, far from using this current distraction that Russia has in Ukraine, it has not used it as much for Taiwan, in my humble opinion, as it has used it in two other geographies, which is Central Asia and the Middle East. What we have seen is, with Russia being distracted with Ukraine, China, through the China Central Asia Summit in Xi'an in May, and the actions that China has done in the Middle East, whether it's the Saudi Arabia-Iran rapprochement, whether it's in terms of deepening its engagement with not just the Arab states, but also the GCC, we are seeing that actually they are using this situation not to accelerate or de-accelerate the process on Taiwan, but to actually get strategic depth in these two geographies. So my belief is that when Japan takes a view, and this is the problem I think we have in the India-Japan relationship, while India does not see a direct connect between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Taiwan, for Japan, I can understand it becomes extremely existential, because Japan thinks that what is playing out in Ukraine today may actually metastasize in its own neighborhood if China decides to become the Russia of its neighborhood. But I have my doubts on that. And that is why this lack of coordination between the Japanese approach and the Indian approach on Ukraine and Taiwan. The third point really is India and Japan have a problem in terms of appreciating their local geographies. There is no doubt that we do pay lip service to the fact that each of us face existential crises in our own local neighborhoods. But when push comes to shove, we tend to be relatively muted. The fact remains that when there are conflicts between China and Japan over the Senkaku, we don't see the Indian Foreign Office going head over heels in making extremely strong comments in support of Japan. We make the normal formulations that is understood as part of the diplomatic protocol, where we'll say we'll stand for a rule-based order, etc., etc. And similarly, when we had the confrontation in Galwan, you did not see the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs going head over heels in pledging its support to India. So the fact is, even though we share this very strong convergence at the bilateral level, we must also be realists and pragmatic enough to understand that the specificities of our local maritime geographies, or even for that matter, our immediate neighborhood geographies, will ultimately keep us at a certain degree of reticence from each other. Having said that, one of the implications of the India-Japan relationship impinged upon by Ukraine is not so much Ukraine, but Russia. And why do I say this? Because we all know, as students of Japanese foreign policy, that in 2000, the last time that Japan had made a very strident position in terms of its northern territories with regard to Russia was in 2003, when they staked out a position and they were talking about how Russia was in illegal, quote unquote, illegal occupation of the northern territories, what Russia calls the South Kuril Islands. But we also saw since 2012 that late Abe Shinzo tried to bring a certain degree of pragmatic deterrence within Japan's regional policy through a kind of a deepening outreach or engagement to Russia. And I want to make this point here, that I believe Japan could learn some things from New Delhi's diplomacy in the current situation. If you want to develop mutually pragmatic deterrence, you have to create equities across the angularity. Now, what do I mean by that? There are two axes operating in the Indo-Pacific. One is, of course, the Russo-Chinese axis, and one is, of course, the Quad axis in the Indo-Pacific. The problem with Japan is, because it's a G7 member and a strong G7 member, it's a strong member of the Quad, and it continues to have the cornerstone security alliance with Washington. It's found it very difficult to balance the axes or the angularity between United States and Russia at this time of deterioration. So it has gone down the conventional path of pledging itself more and more into the equity of the United States, and has actually turned its back on the equity that Abe Shinzo was trying to create. If that process had continued, and I do believe that by walking away from that process and closing the doors on trying to normalize relations with Russia, what Japan unfortunately finds itself in is almost like an overbearing strategic axis now between Moscow and Beijing against Tokyo. If they had done something like what we have done, which is to basically balance all sides, but to balance it productively. There are two ways of balancing. There is an evasive form of balancing or an escapist form of balancing, and there is a productive form of balancing. I think what the Indian diplomacy has shown in this Ukraine-Russia crisis is not an escapist or an evasive form of balancing, which was what India was known for. If I may say, India was notorious for. But we have actually shown a productive form of balancing where we continue to maintain equities with Russia. And those equities not only come from our traditional relationship, they also come from the fact that we buy cheaply, discounted oil in large volumes. But we have also continued the substantive deepening of our relationship with the United States. We have continued to deepen our relations with Europe. So this is a balancing through productivization. This is not a balancing through escapism or evasiveness. Where Japan may have, and I say this with a lot of humility and politeness, where Japan may have painted themselves into a corner is to reverse course on the Abe Shinzo policy of trying to find some agreement with Russia over the northern territories. Keeping that process open would have probably allowed them two possibilities. One, it would have probably allowed them to keep the Russia-China axis, the Russia-China axis against Japan less pronounced than what it is right now. And second, it would have kept Putin also interested because Putin realizes that there are equities to be earned by engaging Japan. If it wasn't the case, then why did President Putin in his Vladivostok Eastern Economic Forum back in 2019 actually try to de-emphasize China's role in that part of Russia and actually tried to overemphasize the role of countries such as Japan, South Korea, the ASEAN countries, and India in the development of the Russian Far East? In fact, this was a fantastic time where Japan could use its engagement of Russia, its deepening of its involvement in the Russian Far East, which would have kept the Russians in a sense off kilter, which is exactly what happened in the Indian case. That even when Galwan happened and post-Galwan, Russia has not fully tilted towards China, but has tried to keep that balance. So I do believe that a certain degree of pragmatic deterrence was in order. But this deterioration between Russia and Japan has implications for India as well and for the India-Japan partnership. Because we would recall that after Prime Minister Modi's quite successful visit to Vladivostok in 2019, India made up its mind very solidly that they would get engaged in the Russian Far East, and that would be a pathway to the Arctic. So the Indian government actually put $1 billion, front-loaded $1 billion in terms of line of credit for investment projects in the Russian Far East. And these would not happen independently. These obviously would have happened in some degree of compact with Tokyo, because it came on the back of the Abe Shinzo, the efforts to normalize the meetings that were happening between, Moscow and Tokyo. So India saw that as a part of deepening their engagement through a trilateral process. And let's remember that in 2021, there was one meeting of the trilateral mechanism, albeit at the working level, at the MEA technical level. There was one meeting that happened online between Japan, Russia, and India to try and set in motion this trilateral. Of course, now that things have overtaken us, it looks very unlikely that that mechanism will be revived in the why not foreseeable future, even in the far future. So that looks like a problem. Now, this has endangered probably Indian interests. It may also have endangered larger projects in which Japan could have been a stakeholder. I do believe that when the Chennai-Vladivostok, economic corridor was conceived, it was not simply conceived to put China on the back foot because you would have regular movement through the East China Sea. It was also conceived in the context of making it a multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder project. And quite clearly within the Chennai-Vladivostok economic corridor, there would have been naturally opportunities for Tokyo to also get involved in this corridor in various ways, because this corridor would essentially pass from the Korean Peninsula and the East China Sea through the South China Sea. So the point that we are making about lack of regional coordinated performance by India and Japan, that could have been addressed because India and Japan could have seen various opportunities along this corridor, from infrastructure building to maritime domain awareness to transportation and logistics, etc. A lot could have been done. So I do believe the Ukraine-Russia crisis and the position that Japan and India have taken has this problem. We must also remember that another important, emergence on which we see a little bit of a differentiation is on the NATO factor. Now, we do realize that NATO has walked back from, Jens Stoltenberg's initial enthusiasm, which was reciprocated by Prime Minister Kishida, where they were looking to have a NATO liaison office in Japan. There is a lot of doubt over where that's going now because it was not reflected in the Vilnius communique. But the point is, on NATO, again, there is a fundamental, kind of a break between India and Japan. And this has its, Ukraine implications. We had former Foreign Minister, Hayashi talk about how the Ukraine situation has changed the landscape and makes NATO, possibly NATO's presence in the Indo-Pacific or maybe the Asia-Pacific, much more realistic now than it used to be in the past. Now, this was the thinking in Tokyo. This was the thinking of the Kishida government. While India engaged in silent discussions with NATO, India has talked very clearly about having no substantive or operational engagement with NATO now or in the future. Now, the point is, regardless of what may have happened in Vilnius, let us say in 2024, a NATO office opens in Tokyo. And this office right now is being talked about with a mandate to basically liaise with other countries, like-minded countries. This could create a certain degree of rift because Japan may want to push India to consider liaisoning with NATO a lot more seriously. And India, because of its relationship with Russia and trying to balance it, will want to pull away. So this may create a little bit of a diplomatic gap between perceptions in this part of the world, and NATO could be the underpinning factor. We do understand and we see this, and we must be very frank about this, that while India and Japan may have convergent positions, we are ultimately basically in the larger context of the Indo-Pacific, a situation of an ally and a partner coming together. And here I say ally and partner coming together because both of us are referenced in the context of Washington. So here is a partner of the United States and a cornerstone ally of the United States, both having different relationships with the United States, trying to build bridges between themselves. And that tension that you see, and then that we saw with the issue of the Japanese plane not being allowed into India to pick up humanitarian supplies, I think it shows very well. Because I would like to remind many of the audience here, and I'm sure there are many young audiences here who would not remember what happened 33 years ago. In 1990, when we had the government of Chandrasekhar in this country, in fact, the Chandrasekhar government, which was supported by the Congress party, this is a long time back, actually stealthily allowed the Americans to land and refuel on their way to Iraq when they were essentially headed for, fulfilling the collective security action of the United Nations. So at that time, you had a dodgy government, teetering on the brink of collapse, allowing the United States, who was not our ally, not our partner, to refuel in this country, albeit stealthily. And this time you had a strong government fully in command of itself, but telling Japan politely but forthrightly that your plane cannot land because this is a military plane, and it would have various different implications if a military plane were to land in India and pick up relief supplies moving to Ukraine. So what it shows is there is a gap in perception, not just about the issue in Russia and Ukraine, but also about providing human security. I have a couple more points on the whole Ukraine-Russia crisis. Where could the issues happen? I think one of the issues that will arise, because right now we are facing disruptions when it comes to food, fertilizer, supply chain, shipping routes, etc., is the role in the global south. Satoshi-san spoke about the Middle East. Now, I'm going to come to that point because I have some interesting take on that. But the role of Russia in Africa has taken on a different meaning since Ukraine has come to the fore. We've seen how Russian diplomacy has become more intense through Sergei Lavrov's visits to Africa. But we've also seen how Wagner's role, without, of course, Prigozhin, Wagner's role also deepening in parts of Western Africa. Let's not believe that all that's happening in terms of the toppling games of leaders in Western Africa is simply military acting in people's interest. There is a certain Russian insidious motive there. Now, if Russia is getting deeper into Africa, the fact that Japan has taken such a strident position on Russia over Ukraine puts not just Japanese interests in Africa into some degree of problem, because Russia would now like to also undermine Japanese interests. It potentially could also undermine our joint actions in Africa. So the India-Japan, kind of momentum in Africa, which we're looking to rebuild, may get undermined if Russia takes up cudgels with Tokyo, seeing Tokyo's system essentially being anti-Russia. I do believe that one of the areas which also gets affected, and this is again where India played the game a little more smartly, at all times when India kept the Russian track open, it was not only for the oil factor or not only for the defense factor, but it's also for our continental access into Eurasia. Because one of the things which would have been dampened if we had not taken that position on Russia would be the INSTC. Now, I do know that the India-Middle East Economic Corridor is a kind of a circumvention to the INSTC, which has been going slowly. But nevertheless, I'm not sure that we essentially want to put all our eggs into one basket, either the INSTC basket or the IMEC basket. The bottom line is both these trajectories need to proceed at their own pace, because they provide you diversified options and multi-stakeholder collaboration within a geography where you're anyway kind of, having problems. And Japan, in terms of its access to Eurasia, and Japan, in terms of its access to Europe, needs to keep Russia in good humor. So what has happened is the fact that India and Japan have had different opinions, because Japan's taken cue largely from its G7 mandate. And I understand that, Japan was, of course, in the chair this year of the G7 and was chairing the Quad last year. So clearly they were under pressure, but this pressure, in a sense, may have painted Japan into a corner. And while India would not like to replicate that painting into a corner, that's caused a certain degree of problem. My last point is over the whole issue of the energy landscape. And this is again important. Of course, Japan has got a certain degree of exemption from the G7 on the price cap with regard to its Sakhalin-2 supplies that come in. But long term, the India-Japan relationship will also be stressed in the light of Ukraine by what is happening between Russia, China, and Middle Eastern countries. We must not forget that the Russia-Saudi relationship outside of OPEC, the OPEC Plus and OPEC engagement has deepened. That has implications for the overall energy market in strategic terms. So with Japan being deeply dependent on energy resources externally, and we know that Japanese resources that come from Sakhalin are not the predominant lot. Japan buys a lot from other parts of the world. This problem with Russia and the deterioration of the relationship could have implications for energy geopolitics and may also drive India and Japan slightly apart when we seek to go and get our energy stakes in the world. I think I've addressed a lot of issues in my presentation. I'll stop here and I'll be happy to take questions from the floor as and when they arise. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Professor Parlekar, well, it is definitely a talk with many points for all of us to not just merely ponder, but also to maybe further research into, because the contours that you have brought out, you started with the ASEAN centrality. Okay, and we don't. We seriously lack a coordinated approach, and that is what Professor Panda and even Satoshi-san also indicated, that we need to have that chemistry built in for multilateral presence. Okay, not just between the two countries, but in third countries or other countries. There is a issue about Senkaku Islands that we know is a persisting thorn in the relationship between Japan and Russia. But then drawing the comparison very beautifully from Russia-Ukraine conflict, you have very clearly pointed to the necessity for re-evaluating Japan's options for settling this issue at the earliest. At the earliest means in foreseeable future, because it has got its own advantages in a world which is increasingly multipolar. I mean, nobody can live without China, nobody can live without Russia too. Okay, USA by itself is not sufficient. Okay, and nobody can live with only the Middle East or the Europe. Okay, we are all interconnected. We can't live without each other. That is the way The economics are driving this world. Okay, and economics increasingly are becoming part of what we call as national interests. Okay, national interest has ceased to be political, in my opinion. Okay, we are not talking about territories, expanding empires and conquering. Alexander came and stood on the shores of the Indus. They're all past. They are consigned to history now. Okay, economics is the new issue which is driving everybody, especially the national interest. You did point to one factor which is quite true, but then it is equally thought provoking, that maybe the synergy on all the dimensions where you specifically indicated limitations later in the later part of your talk is probably driven by the geographical distance between India and Japan. Okay, the very geography of these two nations obviously presents them with as much opportunities and as much challenges which are peculiar to those geographical locations. If just to take you said one thought, like how India has recalibrated its stance, just to provoke maybe some laughter. Okay, if India and Japan were to switch their geographical location, perhaps Japan would have acted differently. Okay, so geography is a factor. We must very consciously look at it. We cannot ignore it. It's a very valid point that you made. Okay. Both Russia, China, and the US led Quad axis. Another point which is very important, because Japan is part of both. And Japan is also part of RCEP. So I would like to add a third axis, the China-led RCEP. So it is not just two axes which are crisscrossing each other. There is a third axis, a 16-nation alliance, okay, which is founded on economic interests, driven by China, and Japan is part of it. And Japan's, bilateral trade, we are all aware, is in excess of, in fact, RCEP alone is estimated to provide Japan with an additional $63 billion income. So the third axis cannot be ignored. Okay, we have to take the third axis also into consideration when we want to look at these issues. Japan to resolve its row with Russia, yes, of course, northern territories, we talked about it. Okay. You made a very interesting observation about the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor. This talk has been going on for almost a decade now. Apart from both these cities, I hope Vladivostok is also equally growing as Chennai. Apart from both these cities growing, the connectivity has not happened. And it is very important, in my opinion, like you said, I'm just merely endorsing what you said, that Japan must work with India to make this Chennai-Vladivostok project going. Not in China, not in India's interest, not in Russia's interest, but in Japan's interest. This will be the counterbalance to the attractions of RCEP, in my opinion. Okay, so there is a serious thought which is required on that particular aspect. You listed quite a few limitations. The Asia-Pacific presence of NATO, which will compel Japan probably to influence India to join or disown or whatever. There are complications. Very rightly you pointed out. Then this ally versus partner dilemma, okay, is an important point that we must carry in our mind. Okay, and in international politics, allies, partners, even enemies matter equally. Okay, you have to balance not just your allies and partners, you also have to balance your enemies. That is what Arthashastra teaches us. Okay, so the Mandala theory. Okay, so therefore there is a very important perspective that you have brought in there. Russian presence in Africa, yes, there's no doubt that it has substantially increased, especially with the French pullout. Especially with the French pullout. It is not for the benefit of Africa. That is my gut feeling, and I'm sure you will also endorse it. But the fact is the field is getting open now. for that cooperation between Japan and India to enter into joint partnerships in Africa to promote local economy, to promote stability, to bring in peace, and of course help support democracy or democratization of those tin pot, dictator rule countries. Okay, hopefully. INSTC and the other issue which you mentioned, yes, it is IMEC and INSTC are again important access in the Middle East. Satoshi-san will be very much more gend upon this. I should not be saying anything at all, but these are two important aspects. But in my opinion, equally important is the connectivity between Chabahar and Kabul, which India has been very, very keen, but nothing has happened, is an area where there is an opportunity for joint partnership. That is how I feel, because Iran and Afghanistan can very well sit with Japan. They have nothing against Japan. And they do not have anything against India too. Okay. So there is a huge attraction there and the scope. If it is not acted upon, as you said, it is a limitation also. Energy landscape, economics. Economics is driving it. Okay. And that is a factor, especially for countries, not just for Japan, even for India, for any country which is dependent on energy supplies from outside its own. From outside its own, we have to factor our so-called national interest through the economic lens to balance out the political contradictions that we have. So your talk has been extremely useful and extremely enlightening. I'll put it that way. With that, I think we have completed this session of the impressive thoughts by three eminent people: Professor Panda, Satoshi-san, and of course Professor Parleka. I'm seeing some questions or some comments in the box. Anshul, do I have time to flag it to them?
So few you can take. I mean, few.
Yeah, I will do that. I'm not going to read this thing. I'm only going to convey this thing. The questions are not specific to any one particular speaker. So any one of the three, you're welcome to just give your opinion. The first one is, how can Japan and India use their plans for Indo-Pacific region to make the friendship stronger and bring peace and prosperity to this area? I think this is a point on which all the three of them have emphasized. Extra national, outside two nations, extra regional partnership. But if there is a point that Professor Panda or Satoshi-san or Professor Datesh would like to add, please go ahead. Any one point if you want to add. Professor Panda?
Sorry, I couldn't get the question because there was some
discussion. How can we make Indo-Japan partnership in the Indo-Pacific region to bring more peace and prosperity to the area?
Okay.
If you would like to share some comments.
Yeah, so very briefly, I would not go in details to explain this, but I think strategic deterrence has been one of the most credible way to uphold peace and stability. And I think between India and Japan, we need to really build that strategic deterrence plan, how to respond to the crisis-prone situation. Satoshi-san mentioned about Taiwan's crisis, Taiwan's contingency. How is it becoming Japan's crisis and Japan's contingency? Similarly, Datesh mentioned about the Ukraine issue, how different countries reacted differently, and how India has taken a proactive measures, unlike to the previous crisis. So I think strategic deterrence has been the most immediate and the most effective way of dealing with the crisis-prone situation in the 21st century. And that's what we need to build up in the Indo-Pacific, and where India and Japan could possibly take the lead. There are three specific issues that India and Japan can take. One, in terms of building credible quadrilateral to minilateral deterrence planning. not only within the Quad, existing Quad formulations, that is between India, US, Japan, and Australia, but also outside this group. Second, between India and Japan, we need to actually build a lot of defense-oriented, security-oriented, maritime-oriented planning in the Indo-Pacific, be it supply chain networks, be it conserving the offering the protection to the sea line of communications or undersea cable planning. Third issue, what we need to do is that we need a greater planning between India and Japan on the security of the seas, be it South China Sea, East China Sea, or Indian Ocean regions. Security of the sea has never been discussed. Even the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talked about the arc of Asia 2 decades back, but we have not really talked about security of the sea, and the security of the sea needs to be the most important aspect of India-Japan dialogue. One question I saw about the Quad, about US, Japan, and South Korea.
I will come to that. I will come to that. Okay. The second question is, thank you, Professor Panda, for that comment. There's a question from Argesh, which I will shorten it this way. Considering whatever is happening, the cleanup which is happening inside China, the generals are getting expelled or whatever is happening, we are all aware. In the context of that, the question is, will Xi Jinping risk appointing a general who may actually revolt against him for the invasion of Taiwan? Floor is open.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on CCP internal politics, but as you know, it's also related to the first question, and also Professor Parodikar's intervention. The China and Russia. Japan is not an neoconservative country, so Japan does not preach in which a regime is good, which regime is bad. But at the same time, we Quad and FOIP, it's a concept not about regimes types, but it's about common lifestyles and common values. It's the value is not always like human rights or democracy, but more basic, humanities. And in this case, if you look at Chinese politics right now from outside, just foreign minister disappears, defense minister disappears, most of the generals disappears. So the common understanding right now, particularly after the Russian invasion and Chinese internal fighting, these are not the regime we can be easily conduct affairs. It doesn't mean we exclude them, but we have to be carefully, and we have to find out other options. Other option is in the Pacific. So Professor Parulekar pointed out there are contradicting interests between Japan and India to enhance our present level of cooperation. But at the same time, for Japanese, India is more amicable partners. Russians are not. That's a basic fact, and that was became manifest after the aggression. So in the past, Japan tries to to be in a good partner with Russia, but there's a huge disappointment after the aggression. So that's a basic attitude right now in Japan.
Thank you, Satoshi-san. In fact, that qualifies the answer for the question for which Professor Panda initially answered. But to come to this particular question, which is there, Argesh has asked, I think I will refer to what you mentioned. Okay. Appointing a general who can go rogue is also factored as the risk factor or the cost factor which China will consider. Okay. If that happens, then again PRC goes.
Yeah.
So there is these are part of the costs of that adventurism which Professor Satoshi-san talked about. So that is the answer. We cannot predict the future. We are not Nostradamus. Okay, we are not crystal grazing here. Okay. But the probability of this happening is also one of the factors which is delaying adventurism on the part of China. That's all I would like to
Yes.
say. Yeah, there is another question from Anchal Sinha. Anchal Sinha. Professor Panda could please take on this. Your views on the expansion of Quad after the recent Camp David summit.
Mhm.
Well, I think this is a critical issue. I think we often overemphasize on the potential and the future plan of Quad. Let's be realistic about this. What is Quad? Quad is not an organization. It is a framework. It is a forum framework. It is not an organization. There is no membership in Quad. So one cannot apply for membership. One cannot withdraw from the membership. This is among the four constituent group members, four constituent participating countries. That is India, Japan, Australia, and US. So there is no membership per se within the Quad. What Quad has done during the pandemic is inviting, like-minded or potential countries who could be potential partners for issue-based issues. So therefore, there is a possibility that South Korea could be a potential partner in many issues that the Quad countries could talk about or collaborate with. So therefore, after the Camp David summit, there is a new kind of enthusiasm I could see among the Korean experts, among the Korean strategic analysts, Indo-Pacific strategic analysts to talk about expansion of the Quad. We need to be realistic that Quad, there is no organizational unit, there is no headquarter, there is no defined charter. It is just a framework. So there is no membership per se. But yes, given the issues that was discussed during the Camp David summit between US and Japan and South Korea, there is a possibility that this Quad plus framework, like inviting other like-minded outside countries, outside these four countries, to be a partner country to discuss with India, Japan, Australia, and US. Many pressing issues on Indo-Pacific is possible, and therefore we could see South Korea could be one potential partner, Israel could be one, Vietnam could be one. They were already potential partners during the pandemics, and they could continue to collaborate with the Quad countries in many specific issues that we need them. But there is no organizational membership, so one cannot apply for that.
Just to add on this new Camp David summit in a couple of months ago in August, and of course for me in the Middle East, Camp David summit is always 1979, but now the world is changing, so the new summit is replacing it. I'm part of history. Anyway, so these three countries, South Korea, Japan, and the US, it has been long partners, but South Korea, we in this geography between just connected to China, just by one country called North Korea. So on the one hand China, and on the other US over the horizon, but Japan in between. So there's an oscillation, huge oscillation in internal South Korean politics, but basically they are strong US ally. We just visited. I just visited South Korean, US UN bases. It's a huge establishment, and in the internal politics of South Korea, there are change in rhetoric. Administration by administration, but now they have very realist government, and US they are very internationalist government. Even though we have many cruel argument with Biden administration, but compared with other alternative Trump kind of administration, the US is more realistic and internationalist, and Japan is always realistic and stable. So, but it can change. So now in Japan, among security experts, there's a word a very difficult word in English. Syzygy. Syzygy means planetary conjunction or series of planets, almost by chance. So almost by chance, we had this Camp David summit. with South Korean realists on top and international government in the US and always stable Japan. So, but Japan will be constant, stable in the near and foreseeable future. But US and Korea in each election they can change. But the basic fact of life, it is almost constant. So now the Chinese threat is more higher, and Russians are very almost collapsing in Europe, and then South Korea have to come to Japan and the U.S. So we embrace them. So for the moment, in Tokyo, we are very happy, but it's not a stable, institutionalized one. Okay.
Thank you, Satoshi-san, for those comments. For the sake of time, I will just admit one more question, which I will pose to Professor Parlika. There is a fear that, like with the weakening economy of Russia, that Russia will become a B team of China. Can this be a matter of concern for Japan and India? If so, will it influence our relationships? Your comments, please.
Yeah, thank you. I will get to this question, but very, very briefly, let me just make a couple of interventions on the other questions as well, where I had very, very brief perspectives to take. The first one, which was asked about Indo-Pacific peace and prosperity and sustainability and what India and Japan can do. I think the cardinal principle in this part of the world is, if you want to essentially have strategic depth in the Indo-Pacific, any collective, whether it's bilateral, multilateral, regional, or or single, must have three dimensions of cooperation. One, you must be a credible provider of regional public goods. And that is where India and Japan need to find performance-based frameworks to be actual, providers of public goods. The second is you need to be at the core of strategic national resilience for countries. That means you have to be not only in countries, but you have to be in the lives of their citizens, in the way in which China has got into the lives of citizens of countries. And third is you have to build what we call in political science as social power or socialization. Now, the point is we not just affinities with countries, but we actually be able to create more coalitions of the willing and to be able to be a part of it. The second point, the second question that I wanted to, kind of address is about, this whole aspect of maritime domain awareness and the Quad. Let's understand from 2017 to 2021 has graduated itself up the ranks. But at the same time, it has also done a neat division of labor now, where they have taken the Malabar Security Dialogue out of the Quad Summit, and they've kept it separate and distinct to the Quad Summit, thereby trying to overcome the problems that existed, which Professor Panda spoke about. Why did the Quad Plus initial avatar fail? Because under Trump, it had no direction, and more importantly, it was seen as nothing but a ranting and railing at China, which would not bring anybody into it. Creating a geo-economic Quad as opposed to a security-heavy Quad will allow the Quad to bring in more countries. He talked about South Korea, even Vietnam. Vietnam was not part of the initial Quad Plus because Vietnam was clear about its interests with China. Since the pandemic, Vietnam is a big beneficiary of links with China, so it remains reluctant to join any organization unless it is very clear to be economic. That's why it is part of IPEF, but not part of a Quad Plus. But let's look at countries like France also, who could be potential parties to Quad Plus. Now I come to the question that you asked me about this whole Russia-China problem. Well, there is a structural balance and there is a tactical maneuver. At a structural level, there is no doubt that in terms of the power quotient, the Chinese are now becoming the predominant player and the Russians are being put into becoming a subordinate or a kind of a supplicant player. But that is at a broad structural level. There is a structural appreciation of the situation and then there is a tactical appreciation of the situation. Russia still holds significant stakes in geographies, and Russia still holds significant stakes in portfolios where it can be a disruptor. and it can be a disruptor for anyone. So it could be a disruptor as much for China, it could be a disruptor as much for the United States, it could be a disruptor for Indo-Pacific countries. So a country which is basically no longer the primordial player in the relationship, but a country that still has sufficient power to damage, to dent, is a country that you cannot ignore. And we must remember that even though China is getting stronger in this relationship, it remains to be seen whether the Chinese military and space technologies, at a time when Chinese economy is softening, will it be able to keep pace on its own through indigenous development, or will it require a lot of Russian support for that? That is why the Indian approach, and you see Dr. Jaishankar talking about it yesterday, when he actually once again repeated that the dosti with Russia is exceptional. And he tried to make that point that nothing will break the India-Russia friendship. I think the whole point is, at a structural level, Russia will be subordinated, but at a tactical level, Russia will still be a very key player in portfolios, strategic portfolios, and in strategic geographies.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those comments. Ladies and gentlemen, with that, I think I must now conclude this particular session. We are a little over time, okay, maybe by about 10 minutes, but then I will take a minute. I have already summarized each of the speakers' points, so I will not take the liberty of repeating them. Only one single point I would like to make. That is definitely not for the eminent speakers and the distinguished scholars who are present on this screen. That point is for students and for emerging scholars on international relations, strategic studies, whatever is the field of your interest. It is important that the thoughts that you hear articulated by such eminent experts are duly registered and then taken forward and explored through your own research. Unless that happens, knowledge will not expand. And when that conceptual expansion in knowledge does not take place, action doesn't take place. We are all familiar with political rallies, where big thoughts are thrown at you, everybody claps, and the moment the rally is over, everybody is forgotten what was said. But an exercise like this, where we are having such eminent experts across various disciplines coming and sharing their perspectives, which are born out of their decades of experience, decades of research into these dimensions. This is a gold mine which you must go and expand it further. That is my only point which I would like to make. So saying, I would like to thank IRF and Yashas in particular for giving me this opportunity to chair this session. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor for me to listen to Professor Panda, Satoshi-san, and Professor Parleka. I do look forward to more such sessions because personally, I'm very selfish. It enriches my knowledge. Thank you very much. God bless us all. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. It was indeed an insightful session on a very relevant subject. I thank the session chair and the speakers for their valuable time. With this, we have come to an end to our first session. Now I pass the floor to my colleague Kalpana for the next session.